Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hi everyone, Patrick here. I forgot the name of the show for a sec that I was recording. Good lord, it's one of those days. Anyway, Patrick here for A Cultural History of Canada. I'm alone today because Mac is out gallivanting on vacation. If you listen to the last episode, you'll know that today's just going to be a solo episode. And yeah, I sometimes do those once again when, we have scheduling issues or if one of us is away. So yeah, that's what it's going to be. And I decided to do something a little bit different this time. And I was going to basically highlight a piece of literature, right, as I usually do. But this time I'm going to actually read out sections of a book of poetry that I think is excellent and actually ties back to a previous episode that we've done. So, longtime listeners will know that we've actually had a poet laureate on the show, George Elliott Clarke, who's a fantastic poet and academic and writer and all around really interesting person to talk to. So, if you want to listen to that, we actually released this a few years ago at this point, and I still think it's one of our most interesting episodes. George was very, very generous with his time. And what I want to do today is actually highlight a book of poems that I guess we can call them poems. It's kind of like a weird mix of styles, right? Which is what makes it so interesting. That Clarke wrote or at least released in 1990, and it's called Whylah Falls. So what I want to do today is actually go over a little bit of why I want to cover this book, read a few poems, and kind of talk through why they kind of impact me so much, right? Before I do that, of course, if you do want to support the show in any kind of material way, you can do so by checking us out on Patreon. We have a very modest Patreon, so, anything that you feel like supporting us with absolutely helps. We either have $1 tier or $3. I think we're one of the only Patreon pages on the planet that still does that level. Anyway, enough with the shameless plugs. Let's get on with it. So, one of the reasons, right, why I wanted to talk about Whylah Falls today, even though it was released in 1990 and is ostensibly not within like the chronology that we've established in the show so far, right? We're more towards the World War II period as far as where Mac and I are discussing. But the book actually addresses a community as it would have existed. Well, it's a fictional community, but he's imagining a community as it would have existed in the 1930s, right? So within the context of the text, it makes sense to discuss it where I'm discussing it now, right? And also, I'm giving Mac a little bit of a break as far as poetry is concerned because he doesn't like poetry or discussing it. And so I'm taking this opportunity for the fact that he's not here today with us to kind of talk about that because I love poetry and I like to talk about it. That's it. So for those of you who don't know, right, a bit of context. Clarke is someone whose poetry is very much animated by very powerful use of language, which is not necessarily unique to him, right, as a poet, but he manages to infuse it with a very convincing sense of racial injustice, right? Or just injustice in general, right? He's infused a lot of that notion into his works, right? And this is really apparent in his first collection of poems, which I wouldn't necessarily consider Whylah Falls as part of his first, right? His first collection, I think, was released in the early 80s. So by the time Whylah Falls comes out, he's well established as a poet, right? It's been writing for almost 10 years at that point. But yeah, what's interesting is that while he is rooted in addressing things like racial injustice, he does tend to move beyond, right, the simple contours I hesitate to use the word simple here. Not simple. The more streamlined and more direct contours, right, of what we would imagine injustice-based poetry, right, or protest poetry to be like, right? So he kind of goes beyond that, and he manages to record a lot of beauty and pain in what he sees as the uh, African Canadian and specifically Africadian, as he would call it, experience. By Africadian, by the way, he means African Acadian, so specifically people of African heritage in the Maritimes, right, which is where Clarke is from. And another thing that I think really marks Clarke's poetry and is especially seen in Whylah Falls is a profound awareness and conviction in the power of myth and literature, right? And I mean literature like capital L and myth capital M, right? The notions of myth and literature. And this is something that, again, is not really unique to him. A lot of modernist poets, for example, or romantic poets before him and generations before him, adopted similar stances, right? We're going to talk about both of these movements in relation to Whylah Falls because he explicitly pulls from them, right? And he does so in a way that really exemplifies the scope of his interests and really delves into what the possibilities of poetry are in the late 20th century as he's writing and publishing. And so there's this fantastic combination of elegance, which he's pulling from a lot of European literary forms, right, as we'll discuss, but as well a kind of directness and a hard edge, I guess, that you would get from adopting more local or jargony, not even jargony. There's a better term for this that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. Colloquial. That's a term. Language, right? As he kind of brings in local Nova Scotian and Black Nova Scotian experiences into his poetry. Right? So I think that's enough context, right? I've been speaking already for almost 10 minutes at this point. So let's kind of dive into Whylah Falls, right? Which for a lot of people in the literary scene is considered to be probably his most accomplished work. I think there's some merit to that claim, right? It certainly was celebrated, but I think I don't think he peaked necessarily with Whylah Falls. I think as a poet, he's continued to evolve and elaborate on his style in a way that still makes him a very riveting poet to read today. But regardless of where we stand, right, Whylah Falls itself did win the Archibald Lampman Award for Poetry, which is a very good award to win and definitely recognizes skill, right, in Canadian poetry. And like I said, is really considered, right, a tour de force. And specifically, I read this in one place where Clarke referred to this collection as being about a place where the death of poetry has not yet occurred, right? And I think that's really interesting. And he kind of addresses this place where poetry hasn't died, right, to pull from him again, in the titular Whylah Falls, which is a fictional community, right, in the heart of Black Nova Scotia. And he basically gives us snippets of people's lives, right, in this fictional community based on historical people and historical archives. And so he mingles blank verse, traditional poetic forms, prose poems, journalistic snippets, I should say, photographs from archives, and of course, right, a very rich language. And he does that in order to recreate in poetic form this, what life for a typical Black Nova Scotian community would have been like in like the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. with all the love, violence, culture that can come with that. So what I want to do is basically read certain sections and I think give you a snapshot of what this is like. And we'll kind of go for however long this needs to go. But for those of you who are paying attention, you're probably already seeing some resonances to what Michael Ondaatje did with Billy the Kid, right? Taking a mythical figure and turning it into a work of postmodern poetry. So for those of you who don't know what I'm referencing the collected works of Billy the Kid, which was published by Ondaatje in 1970. And Clarke is doing something 20 years later, but for an entire community. Same thing. That's reductive, but you get what I mean. Okay. What's interesting as soon as you open this book is that you already know that it's not going to be a regular work of poetry because you start with dramatis persona, right? Which, for those of you who are maybe less familiar with, is something that you might expect in a play, right? You get a list of characters. That's literally what that translates to, right? Dramatic characters. And so you get everyone that you would expect from a play. And by the way, Whylah Falls was actually turned into a play with a musical score that was sung by jazz musicians and so on. So even beyond its status as a kind of postmodern poem, it became a theater piece in and of itself. So, for example, some of the dramatis personae that you see are Xavier Zachary, who's a poet, Shelley Clements, Sheila Clements, Pushkin and Othello Clements, Missy Jarvis, Saul Clements, and so on and so forth. And some of you might have peeked already as to what I'm talking about when I'm saying that Clarke is pulling from various literary traditions, right? Shelley, Othello, Pushkin. These are not random names, right? So already, not only is this a poem, right, a couple of pages in, telling you that it's not a regular poem, but also it's wearing its influences on its sleeves and is going to be actively working to dismantle them. Okay. So you get a kind of admission of this in the next page, where you get both a picture, right, which again, like I said, was pulled from the Nova Scotian archives, right, and you see this woman in a white dress, this black woman in a white dress, and there's a crack, right, in the photograph that is reprinted, going right through her. Very evocative. A very evocative image, and she's standing right next to a tree, right? This massive tree with flowers on it. And what's really interesting is that both the crack and the tree look rather similar, right? The way that there's a crease in the photograph almost looks like a pencil drawing of a tree, right? Of a dead tree. It kind of starts off with a thin stem and explodes out the top like branches from a tree. And the tree kind of mirrors this. And so you get this sense right from the start in the photograph that this is going to be a collection of poems about being rooted in certain places, but also how those roots or these beings and elements that are rooted in a particular place also diverge and cause cracks within themselves, right, by that very rootedness. So, we're going to start here with not Look Homeward, Exile. That's the first poem. It's really good, but I want to start with the first section, right? Because a lot of this is preface. Okay. And section 1 is called The Adoration of Shelley. So for those of you who don't know, the Shelleys, you don't listen to this show if you don't know who the Shelleys are. Mary Shelley, one of the most famous writers of all time, right? Wrote Frankenstein. And in their own lifetime, her husband, or her, I should say partner, Percy Shelley, was probably the more famous of the two. And usually when we refer to just Shelley, we're referring to Percy Shelley in the literary world. That's how they refer to themselves. They refer to themselves as Mary Shelley and Shelley. Um, and so Percy was definitely the poet of the two, or more self-affirmedly so. And so probably Clarke is pulling from Percy much more than Mary in this case, who is better known for her novelistic output, and still today is better known for that. Um, so we start off right with a section called the Adoration of Shelley, and you should pay attention at the very least already to how both the poetry and the character of Shelley, right, Shelley Clemens, reflects or dismantles and tries to dismantle certain romantic feelings, right, which would have been Percy Shelley's movement, right, literary movement. So anyway, I'll start here with what is ostensibly the first poem of that first section, which is called The River Pilgrim, a Letter. There's a reason why I'm starting with this one, and I'll explain it after having read the poem, which is about a little bit over a page long. At 18, I thought the sea blew swept. 5 years younger, you were lush, beautiful. Mystery, your limbs, scrolls of deep water. Before your home, lost in roses, I swooned, drunken in the village of Whylah Falls, and brought you apple blossoms you refused. Wanting Hank Snow would smoke blues and dried smelts, wanting some Mildred's dumb, unlettered love. That May, frights chimed xylophone tracks that rang to Montreal. I scribbled postcard odes, painted Le Fleuve Saint-Laurent comme la Seine, sad watercolors for Negro exiles in France, and dreamt Paris white with lepers, soft cripples who finger pawns under elms, drink blurry into young debauchery, their glasses clear with Cointreau, rain, and tears. You hung the moon backwards, crooned crooked poems that no voice could straighten, not even O, who stroked guitars because he was going to die with a bullet through his stomach. Innocent, you curled among notes, petals that scaled glissando from the windows agape, and remained in southwest Nova Scotia, while I drifted, sad and tired, in the east. I have been gone 4 springs, this April, pale apple blossoms blizzard, the garden flutes, E flats of lilacs, G sharps of lilies. Too many years are past. Past the marble and pale flowers of Paris, past the broken cubist guitars of Arles. Shelley, I am coming down through the narrows of the Shibou River. I will write beforehand. Please, please come out to meet me as far as Beulah Beach. So, right from the start, right, the reason why I wanted to read this poem first, right, which I'll remind you is called The River Pilgrim, a Letter. So, just beside this little title, right, of the River Pilgrim, it says Pace Pound après l'hippo. So already that should tell readers and listeners of some of the influences that are less evident, right, than something like Shelley, which obviously infuses the character's name. In this case, it's a reference to two things. One, Ezra Pound, and I think the Oulipo movement, which emerged in France in the 1960s. Okay, very experimental poets, both of them, for different reasons. Ezra Pound was very influential in the modernist poetics of the 1910s and 20s, whereas the Oulipo movement was very important for what would become more postmodern sensibilities. Very much experimenting the Oulipo movement with dropping letters or rearranging styles and defying expectations of what goes into a text on a fundamental level, right? Probably the most famous one of the Oulipo movement is Georges Perec, right? Who famously wrote a novel without the letter E in it, which is much harder to do in French than it is in English. And so it becomes, right, something like that. And that's probably what Clarke is referencing by just calling them lipo rather than olipo, is that dropping of one letter. But I think the pound reference is probably more interesting on a literary level here, because the title itself of this poem references an Ezra Pound poem. So the Ezra Pound poem is originally called The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter. And so what Clarke does is take this title and take this entire poem and readdresses it to this girl called Shelley, right? Who's, or at least, and the poet is on the banks of the fictional Siibu River. Oh, Sisibu. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Siibu. But on a fundamental level, right, you see again that there's a profound interest in this poem and a lot of the other poems in both musicality, right, which was a huge concern for the modernists, right, that Clarke is pulling from, right, as well as the Romantics. But the Romantics, people remember them very much for the more natural sensibilities that they were interested in, right? Humans' relation to nature, how nature kind of overcomes us and overwhelms us at times. And that's where you get lines like the ones that are right there at the start, right? I thought the Cebu wept. 5 years younger, you were lush, beautiful mystery. Your limbs, scrolls of deep water, right? Connecting human limbs, right, and human traits to, these natural elements like the deep water and extending them out of time and space while still rooting them deeply into the Black Nova Scotian experience, as Clarke is formulating it and manipulating it in this particular moment, right? I really like the line, I scribbled postcard odes, painted Le Fleuve Saint Laurent comme la Seine, right? Sad watercolors for exiles. And this explicit connection between the written word, right? Language, poetic language specifically, right? Odes, these these poems that are meant to be elegiac almost, not elegiac, but that are meant to be praising of something, simultaneously praising the construction of nature, right, in the Saint Laurent River, but also the history of Black exiles, right, both in Europe and in Nova Scotia, and of course in the entire history of contemporary civilizations, right? And so he's tying this history of Black exiles through the slave trade, for example, or through overall displacement. If you want to know more about that, you can check out our relatively recent episode on Africaville, which addresses that in a more contemporary sense. But I just love how Clarke addresses this incredible history in only 2 lines, right? Which is, fantastic. And of course, the references to blues and jazz, right? So you hung the moon backwards, crooned crooked poems that no voice could straighten, not even O, who stroked guitars because he was going to die with a bullet through his stomach, right? Again, 4 lines just shows how compact Clarke's poetry can be, where he brings in the history of blues that tries to channel the incredible pain that some of these singers lived through as sharecroppers, for example, or just with the weight of history on their shoulders, and yet still managing to demonstrate and invoke this profoundly sexual moment, right? Stroking the guitars, and this profound love for music that makes this a much more difficult moment to engage with, right? Especially as readers who might not have experienced something similar. I know I haven't, for example, and yet it's so evocative. And so this blending of violence, music, and sexuality, and love, right? Because they're not the same thing, is really a tour de force, right? Wow, that accent really came out. I hate speaking French words in English. A tour de force, right? Okay, so let's look at something a little bit different here. I'm trying to find one that's not too long because I don't want to like read like 15 pages worth. There's nothing that's really 15 pages, but you get what I mean. Okay, so we'll go here. Yeah, we'll go here a little bit later. There's one called The Student's Tale, which is another reference. 10 points for whoever can send in an email to tell me what that reference is. It's a classic author in English literature, but again, much older now, right, than both Oedipo and Ezra Pound and even Shelley, right? A Middle English poet in this case. So the student's tale goes something like this. Everyone cries for love, but here's the truth of love. There was no struggle, just Uncle Clay uncoiling through the door. He did 3 murders, even their son, wounded in her womb. Aunt Io ruined, a bullet huddled in her skull. Pardon my doubts and my grammar, but don't l'amour echo la mort. Right? A violent and intense poem. So, yeah, obviously the title references, I think, Chaucer in this case. The the Knight's Tale, the Canterbury Tales overall, and so on, right? But it's nothing like the Canterbury Tales, right? Unlike the Pound poem that that is explicitly pulling from Pound, right? This one sounds nothing like a Middle English poem, right? It's a lot shorter, right? And the Canterbury Tales are rather funny at the end of the day, right? They do address real issues that Chaucer would have experienced, but they're meant to be a little bit tongue in cheek. They're meant to be enjoyable, right? Chaucer was having fun with this, whereas you read the student's tale, you get that impression from the start that that's what it's going to be like, right? A student, they're carefree, they're living, and then you get this brutally short poem of a murder, right? That starts, everyone cries for love, but here's the truth of love. Okay. The poem, by the way, is written in couplets, right? So 2-line stanzas. Although it doesn't rhyme. It rhymes at first, if you can call that a rhyme. It's not really a rhyme to put 2 words that are the same together. But it does mirror itself in interesting ways, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But right, it starts off with this addressing of love, right? We want love. It's something that we're craving. And yet, for this speaker of this poem, right, who's not necessarily Clarke, but the student, in this case, student living in Whylah Falls, right, who's just telling a story, all they know of love is that it was a rather violent and bloody affair. Just Uncle Clay uncoiling through the door, Aunt Io ruined, right? A bullet huddled in her skull, right? Someone murdered, right? Someone murdered other people, right? 3 murders. And you often see this, for example, in domestic abuse, right? Just really oversimplifying it because this is not the point of this particular episode, but right, this idea of people saying, "Well, I love you so much," and then turning around and committing an act of violence against someone else. And in this collection of poems that is profoundly mythical, it's shockingly humanizing and grounding as an event, right? Um, and it leaves you to wonder, right? What is this a student of, right? The speaker, who's what are they studying, right? And then you read the poem again, and it's both it's basically a study of life and a study of a certain aspect of love that can be rather destructive when it's not love, right? And that's why it ends, right? But don't l'amour echo la mort, right? La mort in French being death, right? And so there's this warping of language. Again, not rhyming, right? He's deliberately not rhyming, but echoing, right? You get hints of death in love, okay? You know, to kind of put it in a perhaps more romantic spin, that no matter how much you love someone, eventually they're going to die. In this case, they were murdered, and it's not the same kind of thing that you want, but you know that every love is eventually going to end, right? Whether it's in violence, right? Like the one here because of someone's cold blooded murder, or by the very fact of people, right, achieving the end of their life eventually. And so, again, it's these two poems that I've read so far, and I think I'm going to read one last one, really show the dichotomies that are at the heart of this poem, right? Finding love in a violent situation, being able to come to terms with history, and, you know, actually wanting to engage with these issues that make us profoundly uncomfortable, but that are necessary. Okay. So at the end of the collection, right, this is much later on, there's a poem called She Discovers Her Voice, which is in the section of the book that is called, hold on, it's not called Hold On, that is called the Apocrypha, right? So the Apocrypha, obviously referencing in this case biblical Apocrypha, right? Things that are not considered canonical. So the King James Bible, for example, is considered canonical for a lot of Christians, and the Apocrypha are the books of the Bible that we have left out, right? Because they're not considered quote unquote official. The Book of Judas, for example, the Book of Mary, Book of Thomas, so on and so forth, right? These are considered apocryphal in certain Christian traditions. So the Apocrypha here, so the poems in this section are meant to be a little bit outside of expectations, a little bit outside of what has already been established as part of Whylah Falls's history. Okay, so we're going to end on this one. There's so many poems in this, and I do recommend that people check it all out. Okay, this one's called She Discovers Her Voice. Should already ring a bell as to whose voice here. We started off with a letter to someone, right? And now we're ending with She Discovers Her Voice. Against the gray wallpaper of that house, the monotony of beige dawns and dusks, the cankered roses in the plastic vase, her husband's dull, monosyllabic hate. She hoarded words borrowed from the Bible, country tunes and gross, indifferent children. Between her servings of watery tea and his helping of woman on woman, whelping so many bastards he lost count. She counted in her secret verse, hidden in the old scribbler in a drab suitcase, in a drab closet under the old clothes, when at last his secret, hidden cancer overthrew him, taking possession, and she had folded him, beige suit, into a gray casket. She salvaged her lost poems, and she sang, and never blues. Shelley. So you realize by the end of the poem that the she here that's discovering her voice is the Shelley that we started off the collection with. Right? This is not the last poem of the collection, by the way, but it's one of the last towards the end. And so you start to, you get this lovely mirroring that Clarke is kind of performing here, or this echo, to reuse his term. And this echoing and mirroring is reflected in a few cases, right? Um, the repetition in this poem is really noteworthy. Woman on woman, um, drab suitcase, drab closet. Um, let's see, there was another one here. She sang and she sang at the very end. Folding, for example, comes up again and again. And this is something that you see, bit of literary history here, you see a lot in Percy Shelley poems, right? This extraordinary use of repetition, not out of laziness, right? Not because you want to, you just need a shorthand in order to fit the meter that you're going for, um, but because you want to really emphasize something and give it new meaning despite the fact that it's the same word, right? Already, just noting at the very end, a gray casket she salvaged her lost poems. Into a gray casket she salvaged her lost poems, and she sang, and never blues. Sang and sang are in the same line, right? At the end, but they mean completely different things, right? The first one is more associated with salvaging lost poems, singing the fact that she can finally use them, right, and actually salvage them, singing praise. And the other one is singing with those lost poems, right, because poetry can be music, right, with the rhythm, with the rhyme, and so on. And so this is a really good example of how repetition is both something that you use for great effect, right? And can have a profound impact on the reader actually engaging with such a thing. And so that's why, by the way, throughout the collection, you do see these echoes and repetitions coming up again and again, both of history, right? Um, and of the people themselves, right? Repeating certain phrases or reusing or echoing phrases that other people said or that they said themselves because they get new meaning every single time. And this really brings up one of the core things that we're mentioning here, which is that Clarke, in adopting stances and adopting terms from other poets, is not being lazy, right? Or even by doing something similar as Ondaatje did with Billy the Kid, is not being lazy. He's creating these echoes of history, poetry, culture, and his own voice, right? Shining through, and it's beautiful, right? Um, I think this was fun, right? I usually don't want these to go for super long, right, when Mac is not here because I feel like you'll get tired of hearing me just speak alone in a microphone for a bit. But let me know, right? Send an email over. We don't have a Facebook page anymore because Facebook is toxic as hell, but send over an email, right? And let me know if you would like us to just do these readings, right? Whether it's Mac and I doing readings of certain sections and commenting on them, or if you don't like them, right? Just let us know. Regardless, I really find this fun. I do think that Whylah Falls is one of those things that deserves constant rereading, right? It's one of those texts that, like all great poetry, needs to be engaged with thoroughly again and again and again. Both as Canadians, right, engaging with maritime history, but also just as people interested in literary history, right? I think it definitely deserves a spot in that canon more widely, okay, beyond national borders. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. And we should be back to the regular format with our next episode. And I'll catch you on the flip side. Don't forget to share this and do all that good jazz. All right. Peace, everyone.